Gasteratos is the founder and creative director of the Cellular Agriculture Society, called CAS. CAS is an international 501c3 nonprofit whose mission is to advance the new field of cellular agriculture, the production of real animal foods and materials from cells instead of farmed animals. CAS provides a vision for a world where animal commodities of today, like meat, dairy, fur, and leather, will not come from animals tomorrow. CAS has been featured in publications such as Science, The Washington Post, Financial Times, and the MIT Tech Review. In 2018, CAS was accepted into the Harvard Innovation Lab, where Kris was previously a student and researcher when he founded CAS. Kris is the author of the Harvard and Stanford profiled 90 Reasons and has lectured on the topic of cellular agriculture at prestigious institutions around the world, such as Harvard, Stanford, City University of London, Nemo Amsterdam, Texas A&M, and MIT. So please join me in welcoming Kris Gasteratos to the stage. Welcome.
Thank you.
All right, so let's start off. What are we looking at? What is this image that you've brought here today?
So we call this Project CMF, which stands for the Cell-Based Meat Facility. This is a vision for what meat production may look like in the year 2040 in New York. As you can see here, there's sort of a, see if this works as we're testing it. An autonomous Tesla truck here. It's sort of for delivery, a Hyperloop system for visitors and delivery. And I'll get into the process a little later, but that's sort of a look into what meat production might look like in 20 years.
So you're telling me that this is where the future of meat is going to be.
Without killing animals, it would be made from cells instead of using animals. That's sort of the basis for CMF. And it's a project to talk a little bit more about CAS that we started to kind of give a vision, like we talked about, for what this could eventually look like. Because right now, we have a system that's sort of projected like this. If you look up what lab-grown meat is, or that term is so commonly used, you see something like this, and it's just not reflective of what it will actually look like at scale.
So maybe this is a bit more sterilized version of what it looks like.
I think it's more attractive for the press to kind of like push a word like this, and for people to understand exactly what it could be. Cell-based meat is the term we use, and I don't know if that's like as easily understandable instantly when you say this term. So we get that, but we want to show what it could actually look like. Okay. And that's why with Project CMF, we contact our partners at CAS, or some of the leading cell-based meat companies in the world. So we wanted to create something in between, kind of a fantastical vision for just a render that looks really attractive, and something that's a legitimate kind of architectural blueprint. So something in between, where all the numbers and everything you see for the sizes of cell cultivators, the media components, et cetera, are based on what we, myself and all the leaders in the space, think will actually happen within about 20 years. And it's definitely ambitious. So these are not things that are possible today, like the cell densities and the cell cultivators and whatnot, but we'll get to that.
So can you just take a step back again and describe a little bit more about what cell-based meat is?
Sure.
For people who might not actually know?
Yes, yeah. So you would take a biopsy from an animal, and I'll sort of walk through the process later, but it's producing meat as a component, is sort of a mixture of muscle, fat, connective tissue. And so it's essentially creating those components without an animal and harvesting them without an animal, so producing them ex vivo, you would say. And that is kind of how I would describe lab-grown meat in a nutshell. Yeah, it's just making meats without animals. And at CAS, we work on other technologies as well, like making fur without animals and leather. And to be fair, the sort of differentiation here against plant-based is that these are real animal products. They're not made from plants. They are, under a microscope, they should look the exact same. So, yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
So with that,
I'll sort of walk through where we're at. So so I wanted to go through three kind of main renders of CMF, which help go through the process. So we'll start with a media production floor. And so essentially what's happening here is there's a media storage area in the back of CMF, which mixes with treated water in these sterile water tanks, and is mixed in this area here. So we'll just call this sort of media producers, and that's pumped up to the cell cultivators on another floor. The only other thing relevant, I think, to talk about here is, I should talk about media.
Yeah, talk about media. Sure, what exactly is media in the whole process of getting from a cell to a hamburger?
Yeah, so media sort of is almost like the blood for an animal's body, which will feed cells and allow them to develop. And the same thing has to happen without an animal. So media is kind of that artificial sort of blood within an animal's body, and that would allow cells to grow. So we just call that culture media, cell media. And then, so we're in the beef section of CMF. There's 4 sections. We have beef, seafood, chicken, pork. We're going to walk through the beef section of the facility. So there's different media for different cell types. Mm-hmm. A seafood cell would require different media or nutrients than a beef, but we'll just walk through that one. From there, we're in the food processing floor. So this is maybe the most important floor because this is literally how we go from cells to something that people are actually familiar with. So back here, you can see it kind of looks like a wall, but we call this a meat cultivator, which is taking sort of template cells and turning them into more specified meat cells. Let's see if I can zoom in here. And you can also see back here is sort of actually where meat production is taking place, and everything is closed off to keep everything sterile, and simultaneously kind of monitoring for pathogens. And down here, you can see media recycling, which is just after you feed the cells, there's waste products in there, so it's being recycled further in the process.
Wow.
Yeah, there's a lot going in here.
Yeah.
There's a lot of like little details and everything. That's kind of an overview of that floor. And then the main interior is kind of where you see a lot of other action taking place. So most prominent thing here is these cell cultivators. And what you'll see here is what we refer to as a seed train. So you're taking a small quantity of cells and say, take a biopsy from an animal and you have 100,000 cells. How do you get it into a tank like this, which is far more cells than 100,000 cells? So it has to sort of go through what we call a seed train, start in smaller tanks and continue proliferating exponentially until you get to the second largest container, which is over here. It's about 400,000 liters. And then a cell cultivator, which is about 3 million liters, which is very ambitious to what exists today. But a lot of partners in our space think we could eventually get there, perhaps in this timeline, because no other industry has needed mammalian cell culture tanks at this size. So that's why people think we can eventually get to that.
So what
stage.
does exist today? Is it a scaled down version of what we're seeing, what you've been discussing?
I believe the largest tanks today are from Samsung mammalian cell culture, about 15,000 liters. So as you see, a huge sort of jump there. But our criteria when speaking with all the scientists in the space, again, not to get too into the fantastical side and make something that is not achievable within 20 years, is we needed at least three CSOs or leading scientists in the space to tell us, we think we could get there if the demand is there. And we'll talk about what the kind of demand for this facility is and how much meat it could actually produce. So that this is a vision for cell-based meat if it's doing extremely well for itself. A lot of traditional animal products are kind of swapped out at that stage. And then obviously there's a lot of money to go into more R&D and whatnot, which kind of to segue, that's what this area is over here, is a 7 floors, 75,000 square feet of R&D, pork, seafood, chicken, pilot scale up, et cetera. A key component of the facility that we kind of wanted to stress was that it's visitor friendly. And so as you see, there's almost like kind of a school trip going on over here, and people are going to visit to see how meat production is actually made. And again, we're in the beef section. And the only other relevant thing I'll add is that we call these feeder culture tanks. So essentially you're producing components that cells need. Like let's say you would grow liver cells in these, which wouldn't be necessarily in the final meat product, but the liver cells you grow are producing growth hormones, which you're ultimately giving to the final sort of main culture. And so we're using that system there. There's a lot of different ways to go about this. We just wanted to show one of those. Cool. And then that's kind of the main interior. From here, I thought it might be productive to talk about kind of the production process for CMF, because that's always a question that comes up, which is like, how is this possible? And I touched on different components of that. And before having a design like this, it's a really hard thing to say, because you're just like, take a biopsy from an animal and it goes through a tank. And now hopefully it's a little easier to describe what that is. So you would bring raw materials, which is the powdered media, in a Hyperloop system, which is how we kind of thought about doing this. And there's 2 kind of ways to start: how the media gets to where it is and how the cells get to where they are. Cells are kind of easy. You just take a biopsy from an animal and then immortalize that cell line, so you have an infinite amount of cells to kind of select from, technically. And so once you bring in the powdered media, you just store it in wherever, and it's ultimately mixed with the treated water, and like I talked about, into a media solution, and then that is pumped up to the cell cultivators, and that's what's in the cell cultivators to feed the cells that are here. And once those reach a certain threshold where there's, let's say, most of this sort of where it needs to be, and enough cells have grown, we would then empty out into a floor below, which is, again, what I refer to as the meat cultivator, this kind of wall-looking structure. So that's where cells are just template cells, kind of mesenchymal stem cells. And now in the meat cultivator, they're now turning into more specified types of meat cells. So they go through a scaffolding structure, meaning they get structure. They're not just in a media solution. And like I talked about before, down here, you can see, actually, let me zoom in. Down here, you can see in these areas here, we're recycling the media and the waste products that come from muscle cells, like lactate. And there's a lot of sort of analogs to how human muscle works as well, of course. And from there, the process continues by, again, sterilizing everything. Well, it's always sterile because it's always closed off from the environment. And then eventually it's packaged and kind of brought up to delivery. And that's kind of it in a nutshell. And I make it seem so simple, but it's obviously still a long ways out. A lot of
I can imagine
to solve,
there might be a number of challenges that you have, to think through in this process. But so approximately how long would it take for, from start to finish in this process to have a finalized, steak or burger or fillet?
Yeah, I think that question comes up a lot of like how long exactly the process will take. You kind of just plan in advance far enough, right? When Google prepares a pixel from like the first metal to being at the store, it just is ready when you need it, and that's kind of the point. However, to go from start to finish, sell to sort of the final product, it's about 2 to 3 months. But I think a lot of food products are like that. I think a cauliflower takes 3 months to go from start to being ready at a supermarket. So it's within.
Yeah, that actually seems like a very short amount of time.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's also a continuous process. You can create those are some other stats I have. You can create a sort of continuous process where once the cell cultivators empty out, they have a new supply coming into them. So everything's always running and kind of maximizing efficiency like that. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. I guess some other stats that I prepared is sort of the size of the facility. It's 250,000 square feet. One of our inspirations was to try to match numbers of the largest slaughterhouse in the world, which from what I know is in North Carolina, which is about 1 million square feet. If we really push cell densities higher to what most scientists would be comfortable with us going towards, or if you just tweaked some things, if you made some of those cell cultivators bigger, you could get to numbers in this one facility that would produce as much as the largest slaughterhouse in the world. But we didn't want to push that, but we should actually still. People don't really understand how much meat comes out of the biggest slaughterhouse in the world. Sure. It's a lot of meat. It's 32,000 pigs are processed per day. But we still reach a number for CMF that's pretty impressive, so I'll get to that in a moment. And then all of the design of CMF and the numbers are based on non-genetic modification. If you did, undergo processes of GMO, you could optimize things even further, produce more meat in the facility, but we thought to make something that would not be based on GMO. And then lastly is that this facility would produce as much meat as the entirety of New York City, which is all 5 boroughs.
Wow, so in one facility.
This one facility, which is 250,000 square feet. So that's 2 billion pounds of meat approximately annually. Wow. A little over, which is crazy. Like we tried to look at where geographically we would put something like this, and then you zoom out and look at all New York City. And it's like this would feed all of that. And that's kind of just based on the amount, not necessarily the type of meat, right? Like we're just saying you could produce that much. It would have to be more specified what type of meat exactly, which we don't. We didn't go that deep into it. But that's projecting also for meat consumption increasing in the next 20 years in New York. So I think it goes to the population increases and meat goes accordingly. So
very cool.
Yes. That's just like all I had for the slides, but obviously there's a lot more. Yeah.
So how about can you tell us a little bit more about what motivated you to start CAST?
Sure. Yeah. So I guess I have to go back to my kind of my original impetus for getting involved in the space in general, which is I ate meat and animal products, I think like everybody else, like every meal, and just kind of stumbled upon how meat production and meat consumption is so high now that the system has had to change pretty drastically from sort of how I thought it was in a very traditional family farm open system, and it's not really like that at scale, and that brings about a ton of issues. And then learning of a system like this, which seemed to solve a lot of those problems, and so that's where our support kind of stemmed from it. And then I've just been involved in a lot of different projects throughout my time. Then we kind of culminated this organization called CAST to now focus mainly on design and video production, because I think this is a really important thing that needs to be done that was neglected in our space. It's very easy to give an intro on what this technology could eventually do for the world, but to show exactly what this would look like was important. So we have a lot more renders coming, and eventually want to make this into like a VR facility and whatnot. Cool. So yeah, that's
that would really help in communicating what exactly cell-based meat is and how this process would work.
Yes,
leading up to hopefully the future where this might be a bit more
exactly. I mean,
mainstream.
That's why I think design and video is so important. Also, I'm honored to be here at Google because you have the top 2 websites in the world where everyone would search for something like this. When we talk about lab-grown meat, they hear this concept, they're searching on one of those platforms, and I just don't think right now there's a good enough representation for the field of how much it could really change the world. So that's why we're changing our website to kind of better reflect that vision, and heavily investing into producing videos that we think do that as well.
Yeah, and I think what excites me the most right now is this opportunity for a future where we're getting meat and animal products that we don't need to actually, completely raise, full animal and slaughter them to do so. Yeah. So do you think that cellular agriculture might actually ever get our world to a place where the next generation, maybe the one after that one, might consider our current landscape of animal agriculture a bit odd and see this as, kind of a better way to do things?
That was one thing that, just to go back a bit, that I thought was really interesting to think about when we put a school trip and kind of thought further about what that design would be, is like, what would children like this think about something? First of all, they're probably not thinking anything. They're like happy they're not at school that day, like wherever they are. But I think, it would probably, I would assume it would seem normal. That's what they would grow up with. But I think animal agriculture will never truly kind of cease. I think it will just become a small segment of total animal product production.
Would there be room in the industry for both in a way? Or
Yeah. I just think factory farming will die, and I think it should end because it has too many problems that are just trying to optimize it is kind of absurd. But I think animal farming will go back to how it used to be because the demand will decrease quite substantially, and I think cell ag will take over a bulk of that interest.
So, and with respect to benefits on that side, as well as things like combating climate change, how can cellular agriculture actually reduce the impact of what we're seeing now with the industry of animal agriculture on the environment?
Yeah, so I think when you take the animal out of the equation, you just solve so many issues. And so a lot of the public health issues, for example, or the environment directly come from having the animal there, like cows, sort of ruminant system, producing greenhouse gases and whatnot. So when you remove that system, it just seems like it will optimize so much more. I should say, with a grain of salt, as much as, I wrote a piece called 90 Reasons, which talks a lot about the benefits that this potentially has. But everyone should take that with a grain of salt. Like, it's not where it needs to be. We're not in a system like this yet where we know exactly what those numbers are. We're just projecting that when you feed an animal grain, for example, and it has to fuel the entire production of its body and its brain and its bones and everything else, we think if you sort of just fundamentally, if you only select for what you would need, it would require less resources overall. Right. So that's kind of the basic environmental principle behind why this would be far more sustainable than current methods. But there's projections that it might not be as well. I think we just need to be really honest about what it brings to the table.
Sure.
There's 90 reasons, so I think there's definitely more than 90 reasons, but
90 that you put together.
90 that we put together. So there's others as well. But that if it's few of them are wrong, I don't think there's any point in kind of like pushing those. That's why at CAS we are really glad to be an NGO in this space and kind of separate it from companies. Obviously, we advocate for it because we think there's a lot of potential value in this concept, but if it proves to not be, then we won't support it. It's based on this having a lot of potential to solve a lot of issues. So that's where it stems from.
So one of the first times, I don't remember when exactly it was, maybe a couple of years ago, the first time I started hearing about cell-based meat, I was extremely curious about the whole process and what this would look like, but also a little bit hesitant, given like the whole idea of like getting meat from a lab. Are consuming cell-based meat products safe? Should people be comfortable consuming them?
Yeah. I think fast forward here. Yeah. This is why, again, I think a design has value because you can kind of see why it would be safe exactly. So all of this system is closed off. So starting from the seed trains to the media, when you get to the food processing area, this is a floor unlike the main interior, where visitors can see this. You can't really see it, but it's kind of, from our perspective, there's another loop that visitors are able to see, which will be easily to see in future renders. But that's actually closed off to this environment. This is a much more sterile and important environment. I shouldn't say sterile. But the actual area where meat production is taking place is sterile, and all of that is closed off. As an added layer of protection, you sort of have constant monitoring for pathogens, which try to represent here. And that's kind of the reason that this would be safe. There should be no risk that pathogens can get involved in the system. And if there was, you just address it immediately because you can see it. Unlike a farm today, and if you see how that's done, it's a pretty, relatively dirty system that's not like this. And I know that adds to the kind of strangeness of this. It feels like really weird that it would be like this, but that's would suggest there wouldn't be any issues with sickness or anything.
Cool. And then with things like antibiotics and hormones, people are very focused on like trying to ensure they're not consuming them through animal products that we have today. Would anything like that be required in this processing?
Yeah, it's weird. We have some partners who sort of essentially say there's no antibiotic usage because if you have a system closed off, it should be fine. And then others say it's so minimal well, it's just extremely minimal. And so it's so minimal you would almost say that it's none. But I think some say they would potentially consider using that. So that's just going to come up to the, where CAS is kind of out of the equation, and then it comes up to the companies what they want to decide to do. They might decide to go with genetic modification. They might not. The design we wanted to make was based on kind of going to a dozen plus of these companies and the leading scientists and saying, this is where we want to go. Is this possible?
Yeah.
And making sure it would be. And so this is all based on non-GMO, no antibiotics, which again, we need 3, 4, more than 3 usually, but about 3 of these leading scientists who have decades of experience in tissue engineering and whatnot to say, yeah, we think we can get there, whether it's no antibiotics, the cell density. By the way, just if I may explain what cell density is. So essentially, in these tanks, there has to be an amount of cells that you're putting in there, whether it's a 3 million plus liter tank, mainly full of liquid. So how many cells are in that liquid? And so a higher cell density would just mean there's more cells in there, which is more complicated than if you had less cells. And so standards today, 100 grams per liter would be pretty high, and we're somewhere around 315, 330 grams per liter projecting for meat consumption in New York City in about 20 years, which is high, but we have partners that think that is achievable within 20 years. So those are the 2 big things that someone in the space might say that's a little pushing it with this design, is the large cell cultivators and the cell densities. But some people think those are overcomable issues, so that's why we put them in there.
Very cool. So going back a bit, I think you might have kind of touched on this a bit earlier. The cell-based meat, is it any different than actual, meat from a fully grown animal that we consume today?
Yeah, for us, that definition is really important, that it has to be a real animal product. I think plant-based has its space, and I've had the Impossible Burger, for example. I think it's close to meat, but this is meat. So that's kind of the big difference between that. Same goes for other materials as well. And companies that are working towards producing fur, for example, without animals. This is not a faux fur. It would be the exact same thing. So again, that just sort of has to go back to the companies. I think some companies, for instance, are interested in, if you can produce 100 grams of meat and you want to see how many products you can make that into, you could add more plant-based to make it to get to market sooner.
Yeah.
But maybe that wouldn't reflect a product that exists today. But that's what we sort of advocate for, is real animal products that are just made without animals. So the exact same. The only difference a consumer would have to make is pick a different product, not change their diet in any way.
So if the goal is pretty much like matching what we have today, right? Like then feasibly in the future, I might be able to have a piece of fish, a burger that I wouldn't be able to tell the difference between where it came from.
Yeah. In 90 Reasons, I talk about that sort of moment where you do a massive blind taste test and nobody can tell the difference. And I think that's to kind of like combat what, in their defense, I understand why they might think vegetarians and vegans think plant-based meats were similar to real meat. But I've heard that a lot from that community of like, this tastes exactly like meat, but it's not.
It's not.
Yeah. And so I think if you can like pull off a large scale blind taste test and every single person, not every single person, but obviously have results that suggest no one can really differentiate what it is, you've now hit a certain standard.
Yeah. And do you think that's part of the goal in all this, is like, in order to have, people want to adopt this way of, getting meat in the future? How important is it to have that?
I think that's 100% necessary. Yeah. I think if you, I suggest that by the end of the century, most meat production will not come from animals and will come via cellular agriculture. I only think that will happen if you can reach biomimicry to a high level like that. And most of the scientists in our space that have sort of grown up with when I came in 5-6 years ago sort of think that is eventually achievable like that. There's a lot of nuance, right? Like just like with people, when you work out your muscles, obviously there's some interaction that needs to take place and muscle growth. So that might affect how meat tastes. And so electrical stimulation to actual cells might be needed. There's a lot of questions to how to get there, but I think that is the goal. It's not to make something that, it's just the difference between objective and subjective, right?
Sure.
In plant-based, it's subjective. It's like, this tastes great, but it's not the same as meat. And we have the advantage of saying this is the exact same, just without making an animal. And so it's not necessarily better or worse. It's objectively the same. And there's obviously a market for that. Most of the world eats literally that product.
Yeah. So how have you seen the interest in cellular agriculture evolve since you started CAS? And are there more companies entering the field? And how soon can we expect to see products like in our local Whole Foods or at a McDonald's?
Sure, yeah. So to that last question, this is something, again, there's so much range between companies, and most don't want to sort of put a date on that. What I can say is that the majority of companies that we kind of pose that question to say something within, like that's a large scale to get to a McDonald's Whole Food scale. So we've kind of set this marker of like most Americans would have access within a reasonable car drive and kind of would be able to 20-minute proximity at that level where most people could access it, and something in the range of like 10 to 15 years away is what a conservative figure would look like for that. So late 2020s, a lot of companies like to sort of lean towards. As for your, sorry, what was the first question? Actually, I forget.
No, it's all good. Just in terms of when we'd be able to expect to see it in mainstream.
Well, that's kind of the
and how you've seen the industry evolve.
That's right. Yeah. So I did see the industry evolve immensely, and I guess Sergey Brin was integral to that in the beginning, which is, I vividly remember sort of bringing this concept up, and it's just kind of laughable. And then you have some pretty serious people, the Sergey Brins, Bill Gates, Richard Branson's, kind of invest in it becoming a more serious concept like that. And I think, for those who were in it, even before I was 5-6 years ago, decades before, they saw a vision that this could be possible, and it's becoming a reality. And there's finally enough, definitely is more needed if you're interested in getting involved. That definitely ought to take place. But there's scientific expertise that's pushing it forward. There's investment pushing it forward. So it's moving where eventually we'll need to go.
Yeah, and actually last week I saw that a company called Perfect Day released to market what they called a flora-based animal-free dairy product, which is incredibly exciting. But of course, I tried to click on the link and it was already sold out in minutes, I believe. So what exactly? I mean, this is essentially like similar technology that
analog,
they've used.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, eventually, we'd love to sort of build out what that could look like. The tanks, actually, they're just fermentation tanks. We could almost argue if you didn't see those conveyor belts, like that's what's happening here. It's a similar. So you kind of can section off cellular agriculture into technologies, tissue engineering, which is primarily for meat, and then fermentation. So you're taking, a yeast cell or microorganism, kind of programming the DNA there to produce proteins that are in dairy or eggs or other products. And so that's what, when I understand Perfect Day is doing, they'd be better to speak about than I am. But that's kind of the gist of producing exactly what milk is, because it's not an actual, dead organism. It's literally just an animal product that comes from an animal, from bovine animals. So that's the basis of which I think is an easier science to kind of get to, which is why commercialization windows are sooner for products like that. Like you said, they had a product recently.
To market, It's really exciting. So do you consider products, cell-based meat products, as you've described, that require like a biopsy from an animal, do you consider them vegan? Is there another term for what we would expect to call this?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's vegan, because most people would say it's an animal product. So that's why people would say that. I think there's some overlap in like the interest between people who would advocate for this and vegans. But I think that's kind of the biggest difference, is that veganism is calling for a pretty drastic dietary change that most people, vegans might not be happy to hear this, but most people don't want to do that. And it's been proven in reality. But this, as a good friend of mine said a long time ago, this is where the practical meets the ethical. I thought that was a really interesting way to position this, and that's how a lot of products fall under the category there. And just to speak about Perfect Day as well, about the naming issue is like complicated enough when it comes to meat. When it comes to these other products, it's like really
it's even more interesting how to convey what it is.
So that's why we just use this term like cellular agriculture, which we don't think the public would ultimately use, but I think that's just our umbrella term for kind of everything.
So perhaps that's an area of the industry that'll be developing, and we'll see change as well as products come out.
Exactly. At CAS, we were going to work with a company to kind of just name what, for example, CMF. We have some names for what a facility like this would be called. Like traditional meat is to cell-based meat, as a slaughterhouse is to this, and what you would refer to this. We kind of have taken the safe route, just said CMF, a cell-based meat facility, but we think there are interesting names to explore for that. But ultimately naming is important, and that's ultimately what, other companies are going to have names as well for the product, but the general name, instead of Pixel, it's a smartphone. And so what is the smartphone of this? And right now, cell-based meat is that term. So,
and how important do you think that is in like demystifying for the consumer? Like, okay, this is what it is, and also you should try it.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I think it's really important. I feel like ultimately, what's most important is that's why we want to make this a very open facility, is transparency amongst the industry. I've never seen an effort amongst like the CEOs in the space to be so forward with transparency and sort of telling us like, we love the idea of having people actually see what's happening. And this floor is nice, but also to see this floor, exactly what's kind of going on behind the scenes. And I think that's kind of what's going to be most important. Talk is cheap when people can actually like go in there and you can give them all the data that they're interested in. That's not IP sensitive or whatever. It's like reasonable to suggest. That I would feel like would make most or some consumers feel comfortable with what this is. But at the end of the day, it's still very different. I'm just like all of you. I've gotten involved in this space because I think has a lot of potential value. But I can't help but also look at this and be like, this is not how I've eaten meat in the past. This is really different. But if you look at all this has to offer and kind of see that you would never get salmonella eating this. 1 million people, according to the CDC, get sick annually from eating poultry. It would never happen with a system like this. And if you want to know those other reasons, just type 90 reasons into Google, and that's kind of the paper. We have more of those reasons. But
well, maybe here's one. What about things like food recalling? When things go wrong, and then you hear a report, and you might be concerned, like you've consumed something like that. The financial impacts of that too in the industry.
Absolutely.
Would that be reduced in this type of?
Yeah, we think it's kind of impossible, like we suggested, because of the kind of food monitoring that would take place here, and the fact that everything's sterile, but you would have additional measures for food safety. But it's a really tough thing to do, like for me to sit here and be like, no, it's never going to happen. Fast forward 20 years and I'm now like a meme in the industry because like some like food breakout happened, but I think
but the potential is there.
Yes, the potential is there. Exactly. If producers do this the right way, according to like the theoretical basis of this concept, that should never happen.
And you think as like a growing and newer industry that this is something that's going to be a little more like regulated, scrutinized right now as it's, in the process?
Yeah. It's kind of why we differentiated CAST to focus more on design and video. There's other amazing nonprofits in the space. The Good Food Institute and New Harvest are two of them. New Harvest based here in New York, and they work more on the R&D side, regulation side. We sort of stay in our lane and focus on these areas as a smaller group. But those areas are really important, regulation and whatnot.
Cool. So another question, going back a bit again, apart from red meat, so cellular agriculture is being explored in other industries of fish, dairy, eggs, things like that. So I'm a pet owner, and I have, I'm an animal lover. I have 2 cats at home, and they need to eat meat. Are there companies that are doing things like working on cellular meat-based pet foods, things like that?
Yeah, I think that's an eventual application for sure. Right now, it's almost an easier one because I don't think there's as much concern for food safety traditionally with pet food, unfortunately. But it's kind of, usually, in the meat production system, meat that's often not okay for humans to eat will be given to vets.
That's how it currently is.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, but assuming they want to kind of follow with that trend, they would just sort of say like, oh, we can get a animal food, which is unfortunate, but that's how it is. Yeah, I think that's possible. There's like endless possibilities with this to think about, but right now the primary focus is to produce the same meat as humans around the world eat. Yeah. If anyone's interested in following this project in the future, Project CMF, and seeing where things kind of advance in the future, you can sign up for our newsletter at cellag.org. We respect your inbox. We email like twice a few times a year, and our social media at Cell Agriculture.
Perfect. Yeah. All right, let's take the first question.
Yeah, maybe not exactly your wheelhouse, but definitely like interesting. What do you think? Is anyone throwing around any kind of thoughts on what unit economics might be at a 2 billion pounds per year run rate? Like how much a pound of meat would cost in the system?
Yeah. Oh, that's a good question. We have a lot of these sort of really important and direct numbers we have, and that's what we want to publish on our website when we kind of release the project publicly. I don't know that off the top of my head. And you're right, I'm not the best person necessarily to do that. That's why we said it's somewhere in between a vision and an exact kind of like blueprint. So we have also, it's really tough to do that because so many numbers are going to change over the course of the next 20 years. So like how much media costs per liter affects that cost, drastically, the final kind of product. Unfortunately, I wish I could give you a better answer. Yeah, but thanks.
Hi. What kind of trade-offs are there between the gigantic tank versus just having more of the smaller tanks?
Absolutely, yeah.
Is it hard to clean?
Yeah, well, for us, so if you're in a place like New York and you didn't want a facility like this, let's say you wanted kind of a smaller scale facility that would produce just for Manhattan, for example, you might have sort of, obviously real estate's really expensive, so you'd want to maybe build up rather than out. So my point is, if you want to hit 1,000, 100 million liters or in total production capacity for a city, it probably would be better to kind of build that up to save more space than if you made smaller ones wide, unless you mean to make smaller ones on different floors, which I guess solves that issue as well. But that was kind of the main reason to do that. Yeah. Although that's more possible today because tanks are usually not this big. So that might be an easier solution. Thanks.
You take a question on this side.
Hey, thank you for coming in.
Thank you. Yeah.
So in moving to the direction with the aspiration of having these facilities produce the majority of meat, are there any conversations around like chicken wings? And how do you have to replicate the bone and the cartilage,
of course,
and like a bone and ribeye. Like there's people, that we're just conditioned to, if I go to a steakhouse, I want it a particular way.
Of course.
So I think it seems like at a certain point, you're going to, sorry for the vegans, this may be a bit gruesome, but at some point, I mean, if you want a leg of lamb, you're going to have to start a conveyor belt with legs of
no, I know what you mean.
So like how far do you go before you create the entire?
Yeah, well, luckily, for the complexity of this science, most meat is unstructured meat, meaning it's not that kind of meat. I know what you mean. Obviously, when we talk about this being the status quo method of meat production this century, how do you replicate like a Thanksgiving turkey and all of this? But I think that's the ultimate goal. Companies have that in mind. They're like our first gen products. That's why we show just kind of basic products of like meatballs and hamburgers, which actually are, I want to say 80%, I'm not positive on that figure, which is a huge portion. And then everything else eventually needs to be done as well, which is more complicated, of course, to make the bone and the complex structure of all those different products. But that's I think when I say 10, 15 years away, it's more the unstructured products, and that is the next step there. So yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
So important though, obviously, that all of that needs to be done. You can't, people think there's like a red ribbon moment where it's like, it's out in 10 years and then every product has an analog, but it definitely won't be like that. So,
cool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right.
Hello.
Hi.
This is kind of an add-on to his
All right.
question. Relating, I guess, more finite to starting point, given the variety of the types of meat, chicken wings, turkey, leg of lamb, starting with something that doesn't need a bone structure, but then how do you even pick where to start? Ground chuck doesn't taste the same as ground pork, and so on and so forth. So, like, what media cells?
Yeah.
How do you determine where that starting point is?
Exactly.
As you build up to the taste test.
Again, that's probably the best, for the companies. But I would just say, in our meat cultivator, where you just see kind of a tank and then meat is coming out of it, you would have a scaffolding structure that would just, again, dependent a lot on the media, would change, I think, taste and kind of a lot that's coming out there. And there's different media for the cell cultivator and the meat cultivator. So there's a lot that kind of, I think, would influence what you're ultimately referring to. But that needs to be done. Yeah, 100%.
So you're focused on the technology, and somebody else kind of will filter in the media.
Filter in the media.
Kind of like the media itself can change, but you just need to build the technology to.
Well, right now, it's just sort of getting to the point where you're like, oh, this could get to scale at that. And I think there's enough prototypes to already prove that that's possible.
Yeah.
That's, you said it best. That's exactly how it would need to be done.
Cool. Thanks.
Thanks.
Cool. Hey.
Hello.
So as I understand it, one of the issues with meat is that it can take like 10 to 30 pounds of feed for every pound of meat that you get. I'm not sure if there's the same analog for lab-grown meat, but what does the meat eat, and how efficient is it?
Sure, yeah. So that's the media kind of functions. The best thing to use is similar how computers run, or sort of off human minds, right? Is that this is just, we're taking what happens in an animal's body and doing it without an animal. So the media acts as that kind of blood that runs through an animal's body and feeds its cells with nutrients. So I didn't mention this actually, but the powdered media is like base components of rice, algae, grass, which has vitamins, minerals, growth factors, and even those feeder culture tanks can feed the ultimate, the main cell line. So that's kind of what the food is. It's just referred to as media. That's what cells would consume. As for how efficient it is, again, those numbers are really kind of like tough to come by. At this point, when it's so early, there's so much experimentation still taking place, but everything looks in the direction that it will be far more resource efficient than taking, feeding, you said it best, right? Like 30 pounds to an animal, which ultimately you're discarding a lot of those other products. So just.
All right, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
Have you tasted lab-grown meat?
I haven't. I've had the chance to, but I personally think a lot of testing should take place with this. Like to go back to our sentiment of like this is a really different thing, and I think a lot of testing should take place. But when that happens, and I think there's like thorough enough testing that I think most people in this room would be okay with. I know there's plenty of people in our field that are excited to be like the first ones to try it, and that's great. Yeah, I just think for this to work, it's a very fragile concept. This cannot come out in 10 years and sicken half of New York or something. It would like destroy the concept. So it needs to be in a really, strong safety position. So that's why I haven't. But
so it's not in a state where people are trying it.
Well, like Suzette mentioned, I think Perfect Day is giving out products early, and there's other companies that have kind of started. But if you're talking about meat specifically, it's still a ways out. And when we say 10, 15 years, remember we're talking about most people can access that. So sooner than that, it should be in high-scale restaurants, and maybe that's where people are trying it. But people have been trying it for since I remember in 2013 with Sergey Brin's project with Mark Post. People were trying it then, but I don't know if that's representative of what it would actually be like. So I don't know if that's fair either. But yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, thank you for coming.
Yes.
My question is more about the ethical side of it. Today, when we pick some meat to eat, we know it's actually from some animal, so we know it's chicken, we know it's beef. With this kind of concept, how do we make sure the original cell that was used to grow the meat is actually from specific animal?
That's why you would need a third party to kind of like. Or, I mean, if a producer is that dumb to be like, we're going to give seafood to people and it's actually chicken, they're like shooting themselves in the foot. So I think that's a pretty dumb thing to do. But there should, I think that's where regulation comes in as well. Kind of make sure that everything gets to where it needs to be.
Yeah, but what if the unwanted cells were mixed in it? And how do we even distinguish this is not purely beef, but mixed with some unwanted cells in it?
Absolutely, yeah. It's a good ethical question. Like you said, there needs to be proper regulation. If companies are not following through with what they're saying, that's extremely misleading. And this is the beauty of capitalism, that they would probably not exist further after that happened, I would assume. If they were selling, here's our beef, and it's like seafood the whole time, I hope people would not be too fond of that. So both regulation and like there being a general third party and economic forces, I think that would prevent that from happening. But could happen. I hope that doesn't happen. I would be really disappointed in any group that did that. But
Thank you.
Yeah.
My question is very similar to the previous one, which is just thinking about how I imagine if and when this gets mainstream, we would eat lots of more different types of meat than we do now, like certain animals, like maybe rabbits, where it's like too expensive to make a large scale amount of rabbit meat, but now with this maybe you could. And so then I started, like, my mind started going to like all these other things, and I'm like, what if there was a malicious person that wanted to like put a human sample in there? And I know that sounds maybe crazy, but maybe if I thought it, maybe someone else might think it too.
Yeah.
And so I heard what you just said about there needing to be a third party and regulation, but have you thought in the design of the building that maybe there should be like extra security around that initial sample or anything like that? Yeah,
there has to be. Yeah, that cannot happen. Like, quite simply, unless some weird market comes out of like cannibals in the next like 20 years, maybe, I don't know. But for the most part, we kind of just picked 4 really popular meat species types of beef, seafood, chicken, pork, and that's what it should be. But that stuff, like, that's been said for so long. Yeah, that could happen, and then is cannibalism ethical then if that happens? There's like so many questions that come out of this for sure. But yeah, that's actually been posed if like this were to supply meats for a human population on Mars, and then like the cell bank were to corrupt, and the Martians were like, how do we make meat now? And they like look down and like sample themselves or something. Yeah, but hopefully that never happens like that. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks for coming, Kris. Can you tell us about who is leading in this space? Some of the companies we can go follow, so we know who's making beef, who do we go for chicken?
Sure. Yeah. All right. You're gonna make me pick the companies. There's a lot. I think the best thing I could say for that would be if you look up cell-based meat on Google, you would probably find those top companies. Or our new website, which will come out next month, will have kind of a comprehensive list of all the companies in the space working on ranging from the meat to the leather to the fur. Well, not actually to the leather, but to the fur and all these other kinds of products. And dairy and eggs and everything else. So I cannot pick just like one. The other ones will like haunt me if I just say, oh yeah, go to visit this one. No, but there's a good amount of companies as well, and a lot of them are in the Bay Area, and some in Europe, and yeah, I think a dozen plus. But there's a lot of stealth companies as well that we're in contact with. So a lot of companies, and then there's some that work on special like only fat or mainly fat or only seafood or certain type of seafood. So yeah. Hi.
Hi, thanks for coming over here. So one thing I'm wondering is like now like the meat market have like a lot of like different cut, and even for the same kind of cut have like different level, like the 5A steak, stuff like that. So with this technology, it's like, is everybody gonna be like feeding on the like highest level of meat, or is still
5A is what exactly?
I think it's about the fat that is
interesting.
Like,
yeah. You're saying like a lower fat content or something?
Or like more fat content.
Oh, more
and
fat
have
content.
like a marble kind of like texture.
Yeah, well, this is why it's really, I hope that a lot of the traditional meat companies are interested in this technology, because you would make the exact same product every time, which is pretty much impossible right now in the meat industry. So that could be possible, and it kind of changes the scale, right? It's like I think that would be the case. You can also like the possibilities are really endless. You can make a burger that's 100% meat, 0 fat, and things that are really difficult or impossible today with traditional meat production. You can make meat, like she said, from different animals that aren't traditionally done, or like combinations of rabbit and flamingo, or like whatever random animal you would pick. I don't know. You can like, maybe I should have said flamingo. You pick cells from any animal and kind of put that together. And right, that's the difference between plants and animals. Animals have a muscular system, so you could select from that. But yeah, I think the standards would change in a positive way. It would like be kind of absurd if anyone ever got sick from something like that, where today just is pretty common.
Right. I was just wondering, like theoretically, the cost of like create those kind of meat is going to be the same.
Yeah, well, I don't think this will take off until it gets to the same. There's a lot of numbers thrown around for years, like 350,000 pound or a dollar burger. That's how much it took. I spoke to those researchers directly. A lot of people don't know where that number came from. So like no one knows what those numbers are really. Like obviously the companies do, but it's definitely decreasing all the time. And I think when that inflection point happens where it's the same, is where things will get really interesting. Because right now it's obviously more. It's not even out yet. But when that happens is when people will be faced with a decision of like, this is the same cost, the exact same thing. It doesn't kill an animal. In today our conversation, 32,000 animals are killed every second in animal agriculture, including seafood. And so that would never happen. You have no chance to get sick. You have no issues with the environment. Kind of projecting that all the benefits for the concept hold true. So why not select that? Or why? There are probably good arguments. I like to hear them as well. And people would have different reasons. But I think it won't change until, like, society won't change drastically until that cost inflection happens. Thanks.
Hey, so first of all, I want to say that the renderings look great.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Wow. Thank you.
I can tell you put a lot of work into it.
I need to shout out my co-designer, Mihai Iacubovschi, who's the visual designer on this and made so much of it look as attractive as it does. Yeah, I've sort of mainly serve as the concept designer, but thank you. Yeah, hundreds of hours like into the design. And there's a lot more coming as well.
Great. A couple things that I would hope to see, like if you in your future renderings, like this one, it seemed like there might be like power efficiency, and for scale, like it seemed like it would be kind of like the museum or like the display. Like I was worried about children spitting over the edge into
we thought
the meat. And like
initially we wanted to put that food processing floor up there, and then it was like, what if kids like throw stuff at it? So then we had the food processing below. It's definitely not like optimized the best, right? There's like, it's going up and then down too much, but there's always this balance between, at this stage, trying to create a really attractive design and then trying to make it as like real as possible too. Yeah. So we kind of took, not that it's not possible, which is not the most efficient way to do a lot of the things that we're kind of suggesting, but like you mentioned the design, and that just always will happen. It's also hard to design something in 20 years. We're thinking like, should there be a parking lot if all the cars are driverless, and like all these questions that are tough to think about. But
because I think if you look at kind of some of the indoor growing pictures of where they have it like stacked like floor to ceiling,
mm-hmm.
and Also, there's also like the AC inside the building might be really expensive. So there's some limestone caves that they converted into office buildings or like places where you can store stuff, and that might be a good location for this kind of thing. So you get the AC pretty much for not
That
for
sounds
free,
great.
but
Yeah.
they
Thank
have
you for
like
the suggestion.
gigantic, like 60-foot high caverns where you can put this kind of stuff.
Oh
in.
wow, yeah, that sounds great. Trust me, I'll be rewatching this and checking on that and like incorporating all the. Yeah, it's hard to make something that is kind of from scratch that no one even really like. A lot of the companies obviously were immensely helpful to make this, but that's kind of where the difficulty came in. Do you put the cell cultivators and what orientation do you put them in? And how do you maximize space exactly? I don't have an architectural background in kind of doing that, but we knew what had to be in there and just kind of figure it out from there. That's super helpful. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah. All right.
So my brother-in-law's family, they've raised a few animals in the past for consumption, chickens and pigs. And I was wondering if you ever thought about this technology being moved into the DIY space where individuals can do their own meat growing.
Yeah, there's a community of people who do that in Japan, and a small one, I think here in New York as well, or and definitely in the U.S. But absolutely, that's something that I think is happening already. You're saying like a community. You're saying in like the future, someone would kind of make
like
that.
in the future, instead of raising your own chickens, you'd take all the cells and grow them in your house.
Yeah, like that's why we got into design with Cass, because there was so minimal like design efforts in the space. But one of them definitely is someone made a like homemade meat maker that would be like in 50 years or something that would be possible, and you kind of just like pick the cell you want and then it comes out. But we haven't gone that far. I think that's like possible definitely to do, and would be interesting for sure.
All right, thanks.
Yeah.
Cool.
I was wondering with the cell bank that's created from a biopsy or whatever from an initial animal, does that last for like all of eternity, or do you ever need to add new cells?
That's sort of the concept, right? The concept of like an immortalized cell banks that you kind of have a you said it best, it's infinite supply of cells. And so that's why, again, different companies are kind of approaching this differently, but it would maybe be possible to take a biopsy from one animal, never touch an animal again, and produce meat.
Unless you wanted to add flamingos, I guess. But and then another question I had was, would you have the same issues with like cholesterol, carcinogenic effects of meat with this?
Sure, yeah. So if you make it the exact same, you have to stick by it being the exact same and having some of those issues. So I think you definitely could, for instance, not have like animal fat. You can make the fat something else, but then that wouldn't make it the same. So again, up to the companies to kind of think about what they exactly want to do when they release products. If they want to maybe have different lines of something is 100% meat, maybe no fat, plant-based fat, real fat, and my thought process is just like predicting what people would be interested in is the first gen should be the exact same. As people get more comfortable with it, maybe start like experimenting with different stuff. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes.
And then I think we have time for just one more question over here.
You've talked a lot about the benefits and the impact to the environment and to animals. What are some of the risks and concerns being discussed amongst the industry now? And I'm going to spit off one that like will sound very far-fetched now, but I imagine in 20, 30 years time when this is an actual reality, like I'm imagining if we have to regulate the meat so that there's not a ton of differentiation for the consumer, perhaps the differentiation is real meat versus the ethical cell-based meat. And if we are introducing new types of meat, say the flamingo comes into the picture again, and then all of a sudden,
is like now the alternative.
Then all of a sudden, customer differentiation becomes like the real versus the ethical meat, and therefore maybe the real has like a higher brand value. So now we're going and killing all the world's flamingos. Like these are some things that sound extremely far-fetched, but I imagine in looking at something that's such a reality in the future, like what are these far-fetched things that are concerning you now?
Yeah, well, that's a great one. I think it's hard to predict. The other reason it's so hard to predict is because there's so many intersecting technologies that could affect this. We talk about like a scenario where, the first trip to Mars, which would be maybe funded by like filming it and like streaming it to Earth, and everyone would watch that first group of people to go to Mars. Maybe they're consuming cell-based meat, and if they are eating it, maybe it becomes like a popular thing on Earth because of that, or maybe it kills the colony and then everyone doesn't eat it here. And it's like that. If the projections to go to Mars are real, maybe that could happen as well. But we have to be honest about the ways it could be negative, and that's definitely one of them. Another one is talking about not making it the exact same with like chicken wings and other products that won't be available, and the impact it can have on farmers and the farming community too. That all needs to be thought about really seriously. And I think it's really naive to, especially as the person who wrote about 90 benefits that it has, to say that there's no downfalls. There's obviously downfalls. There's just, like anything in life, just seems to be more positives than negatives in this case, but there are negatives and they need to be talked about. You mentioned a really good one. Yeah. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much,
Yes,
Kris,
thank
for
you. I'm
coming
honored to be
in.
here. Thank you.